Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie Pack. I still don't have my voice back, but we're going to go ahead and record a podcast episode anyway. I have with me today Bridget, who has been on the podcast before.
Hi.
Bridget's waving hi for those of you who aren't listening with the video. So I'm going to give a little bit of background info on this podcast, and then you can fill in what I left out. So Bridget's been dating a guy. It's been getting pretty serious. And so they were looking at doing some couples therapy or something. And he found this class offered through community something. So they signed up for the class, and Bridget has been entertaining us in staff meeting with stories of what they are learning in this class, that the information is very outdated. I think one of the things you were showing me, I said, oh, that sounds like how we were talking in the 80s. And you said, oh, yeah, this is like 1986, 1987. And I was like, oh, yeah, I mean, inaccurate information then, but I thought we had known that was not good information for couples. So I said to her, we should do a podcast episode where you talk about all the things that you learned in this class, and we can laugh and we can say why it's wrong, why it's outdated, and offer better information.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, so this was like a 6-week community class. It was like $79. This is a class for people that maybe can't afford to go to therapy or just don't want to, whatever the reasons are. But oh my gosh, like my first indication that maybe this class was not going to be great was when the advertisement for the class said, welcome to, or what did it say? Like open to everyone, open to everybody of all backgrounds. It's like, well, if you need to explicitly say that, like,
then it might not be.
Right. Like, what are we doing? The second indication that this class probably was not going to be what we were looking for was when we show up and find out that the instructor is 91 years old. This is not an exaggeration. This is not an exaggeration. He told us his age and he said he was 91 years
old. And you said that his son had to come pick up some or hook up some technology stuff, and that he was probably in his 70s.
Yeah, his son was 60. His son was there. I don't know why he was there, because everything was paper, Jackie.
Right.
Everything was paper handouts. There was not a computer to be found anywhere. So I think his son was just there. I don't know, maybe to
in case of a medical emergency.
Right. His son was only there for the first 2 classes. I actually met 2 of his sons because his other son was the financial guy, and he was younger. I don't know how old he was, but yeah. So my boyfriend and I, we were just like, well, I guess we'll see what happens. We'll try it and see what happens. My third indication that maybe this class was not going to be the greatest was he gave us a handout. I have it here, of like all the weeks, like each week, what we were going to go over. And I remember just looking at this handout, and one of the weeks was I can't find it now, but the differences between men and women, which I don't love that.
But it is very 1980s.
Very heterosexual, cisgender material. The material assumes that everyone is in a heterosexual relationship and there's no differing gender identities between the 2 people.
Right. And the roles are pretty gender.
Absolutely. So we get to, I don't know, week 3 or 4. And that was when he went over physical intimacy and the needs of men and the needs of women.
And to be clear, because this guy was, we hope, a retired therapist.
Yes. Okay. So yes, this guy did have some credentials eventually at some point in his life. I was pretty confused as to whether he still did or if he still had so he's a counselor. He went to school for counseling. The whole time I was like, I want to know where this guy went to school. Where did this guy get a degree from? And he had a counseling practice for many, many years. And he liked to boast a lot about how he has helped men be better partners and give their wives affection and love and whatever. But he was primarily, it sounded like he was a family and marriage type counselor.
Okay.
And I'm assuming he's retired.
We hope.
I don't know.
We hope.
I don't know.
He should.
I don't think he explicitly came out and said this, but my brain filled in the blanks with LDS. I'm pretty sure.
From
LDS.
what you were explaining, different things he would say, he was definitely showing up, or like he was flagging the LDS radars.
For sure. There might have been a comment potentially that was like, oh yeah, he's part of the church, but I don't think it was explicitly like he ever said I am LDS. So that was my instructor.
And there were how many like couples in the class?
So there was me and Cole, my boyfriend. There was another older couple, and then everyone else was singles.
Okay. But wasn't the class, was it about?
It's like remarriage success.
Yes.
Yeah.
So marriage after a marriage.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah.
For divorced. I mean, Cole, my boyfriend, he's not divorced, but we thought, I don't know. He's marrying someone who is divorced.
Yeah.
But the rest were divorced and single. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they were there to meet other people. Maybe they were there just to get information. Who knows?
Yeah.
But there was only 2 actual couples in the class. And there was a big age gap there. Cole and I think Cole and I were actually the youngest people in my class out of all the people. So, yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that was so amazing to me is you didn't really make comments or speak to the disinformation, which I'm impressed by. I don't know if I could do that. Honestly.
I mean, I was like holding my chair and I gave you the notes,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
Like you could see my handwriting of just like I was crossing things out. I was writing notes to Cole. One of the notes was just like, I was completely clocked out. I wrote down, what do you want for dinner? Like, I wrote on here, I'm so uncomfortable right now. Him and I were writing notes back and forth. And I was putting on my sheet, the information that was correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of snide notes on my papers. Yeah. But I don't know, Jackie, it's so uncomfortable when you're in a group. And I could tell Cole was also uncomfortable with some of this information.
Which is a green flag for you to continue in the relationship.
Absolutely. When we came home from this class, I looked at him and he was like, so what the fuck was that? And I was like, right. Because if you had any other response to this, we would have some big conversations and this probably wouldn't work out. But everyone else was like agreeing and nodding along. And in my head, I'm like, okay, is this real? Like, are you actually agreeing? Or is it just because we're in a group full of people and it's sort of this like, herd mentality, where I just kind of have to like, I don't want to be the odd man out. I don't know. Right. And also in my head, I'm like, I'm not going to change this 91-year-old's mind.
Right.
Like,
right.
I don't know why he's teaching a class. Like, if I were 91 years old, I feel like my thoughts would be, I'm probably aged out of this culture. And so I need to go with my people and, I don't know, play bingo or pickleball or something.
Right. Right.
I don't know. But you're right. Yeah, I did not say anything. I did put it on my review. He like handed out a review form and I said, this information is outdated and did not feel inclusive. Put something like really indirect, like my partner and I had good conversations after classes about some of the material, meaning we had conversations like, so that's wrong, right? Yeah. We're not doing that.
Right.
So yeah, it was an interesting couple weeks there. I don't know, do you want to get into like some of the
Yeah.
stuff
Yeah.
that he
Let's get
said?
into some of the information he was sharing and the advice he was giving.
Oh my gosh. Um, Let me tell you, when he handed this out, the first thought that came to my mind was, I'm so happy that I get to take this to work.
I'm
I'm
so
so
happy
excited.
I could go to work and I know they're going to laugh with me.
Right. Or I'm so happy that like I was just excited to bring it to work. Because I was just like, what the hell is this?
Right.
So one of the weeks we went over physical intimacy and the differences between affection and sexual attraction. So the basis of this material is based off of a book called His Needs, Her Needs by Willard F. Harley Jr. You can Google him and get your own
Right.
opinions about this guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think one of the other therapists had looked it up and saw that the publishing company was an evangelical Christian
Yes. Yeah.
publishing
Yeah.
company.
And that I think he was a pastoral. Didn't she look that up and say, oh, yeah, he's, well, no, maybe it
Something.
wasn't that he was a pastor, but he was, because there is a thing for pastoral counseling that has more
Yeah,
limits than for therapists. But I think she just said,
right,
oh, no, he is part of the evangelical Christian movement,
right.
which for some really conservative Christian religions, they really haven't updated since the 80s.
Obviously.
Right. Right.
Yeah, yeah. So he is a some sort of counselor. I can't remember if he's I don't think he's a psychologist. I don't think he's got a PhD.
Uh-huh.
But he's got a bunch of, so this is Willard. He's got a bunch of, I think in Minnesota, like 32 different types of clinics, 32
Yeah.
clinics, like mental
Right.
health clinics. And he's in the marriage and family therapy game.
Mm-hmm.
I believe he's still, according to the website, it sounds like he's still prepped. I
It
don't
did
know.
sound like when we looked it up, it did look like it was still open and operational. And because it mentioned that he and his wife do a daily call with people
Hmm.
and that their two children are coaches carrying on the work.
Yeah, I think I read that. I know about the daily call. You can go to their website and listen to backdated like radio type. I
Okay.
don't think they called it a podcast anyways. So all of this material is based off of this book. And oh my gosh,
Did your instructor or was it Willard who referenced the book Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus?
I think it was the instructor. That was a
Okay.
different week.
Okay.
So there was physical intimacy week, and then there was a second week because by the end of physical intimacy week, Jackie, I was like, I'm never coming back here. Uh, but we did end up going back for a financial thing, which actually
Mm-hmm.
ended up being sort of helpful. But during the week that we did go back for the financial thing, he had given us the week before's material about it says what the wife needs to know about her husband and husband, what you should know about your wife. Anyways, with a lot of exclamation points.
Uh-huh.
um, so this is
Because
physical
that book is,
intimacy.
let's just talk about that book for a minute because it's
Yeah,
also pop psychology, not really any scientific backing on the claims in there.
yeah.
I mean, I think it's still a popular book and some people find helpful information in it, which is alarming or scary to me because it's very typical stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
He's referencing these biological differences between the sexes, which I
Right.
just don't know because it's not scientifically backed. I don't know that we can say those are biological because he doesn't account for socialization and the culture you're brought up in and the family you're brought up in, which I think a lot of those differences have more to do with that than they
Mm-hmm.
do with biology. Anyway, yeah, so that's also just not, but it all is similar information, I will say. That book,
Yeah.
Willard stuff, your instructor stuff, all kind of in that same vein.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm also, so I'm reading, this is kind of a tangent and a sidestep, but I'm reading Purity Myth right now. Have you read it?
I haven't read it.
It's very good. I'm only in chapter two, but like, I don't know, like the fear of women's sexual desire. If women know this about themselves or have this desire, like, then what does that mean for men? What does that
Right,
mean
right.
for like our bottom line?
I
I don't
have
know.
read other books that take that on and will talk about how women owning their own sexuality is very
Hmm.
threatening to patriarchy. It always
Right.
has been threatening to patriarchy. So then when you have patriarchal religions, there's a lot of, I think, damaging information about female sexuality
Yeah.
that is damaging not just to females, maybe more so to females, but it's also damaging to their male
Yeah.
partners.
Right. And that's, I mean, that was the thing that was thinking. And I do kind of regret not saying something. But again,
To what
I don't
end,
know how much.
right?
Yeah. And I was thinking as I was sitting here there listening to this information, I'm like, okay, we don't know any of these people's backgrounds. What if one of these people has religious trauma or sexual trauma
Mhm.
of like having been raised maybe in a conservative religion and being told this, and then potentially marrying someone that also had those same beliefs and being traumatized by that? And
Mhm.
then going to this class thinking, oh, I'm going to get some information on how to build a future healthy relationship. And then being met with the exact same thing. And then thinking, well, shit, is it me? Am I the problem? Am I crazy? I don't know. Right. Like I
Mhm.
kind of went down a wormhole there, but yeah, like, I don't know.
Mhm.
It was just crazy. Because in here, and again, like, where does this information come from? Like you said, like, he differentiates between men and women's sex drives. And it
Mhm.
says sex for men, sex drive is discovered at an early age between 8 and 13, which there's no reference here to where that
Mhm.
information is coming from. Because 8 to me, even for that seems early, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what the research says about that.
What
For
I have heard,
yeah,
and I believe there is research on this, but this is not from the information he's taking. This is
right.
information with kids having access to the internet. And I remember when my kids were young, I had heard or read a reputable source, I couldn't tell you who now, that if your kids did not hear about sex from you by the age of 9, they would hear about it from peers.
Mm,
So that puts it in that category. And I think currently the stat on first exposure to pornography is around 10 or 11 years old.
yeah.
So, yeah, it's not out of the realm for being young. I was talking to my kids about it. I feel like I was always talking to my kids about it. But before 9, I connected all the dots of what I had been giving them up until
Mm,
that point. Um, and it might have been a little bit younger for my youngest because I feel like the youngest child is tethered to the older children and is exposed to the information that they know, good or bad. Um,
yeah.
they're just more connected to them. And so
Yeah.
I sometimes will say, my youngest, she never got control of the remote control. She watched what her sisters were watching, and it was not Barney. It was not the things that the kids in her kindergarten class were watching.
Right. But I mean, I think everyone knows this, Jackie, right? Like you have all daughters.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
And the assumption here is that in this material, the assumption is this is just men or boys because
Right.
it says women, their sex drive is discovered much later, if at all.
Right.
Girls generally do not have much of a sexual history before marriage. And that is like, okay, so here we have, yeah, for men, ages 8 to 13. And for women, well, we don't really like they don't really have much of a sexual they don't know they haven't developed it yet and it's
Or
like
they haven't discovered it yet, which I mean,
and that's
I've worked with some of those women,
sure
like,
they
and
do exist.
yes,
Yeah.
and usually that's some failure on the part of parents. It's like
Right.
friends were not talking about it openly, and their partner or their spouse didn't really care if she discovered orgasm or not.
Right. And again, like how much of that is cultural
Mm-hmm.
of like, I'm gonna assume that those people were in conservative religious households
Yeah.
based in a conservative religion that wasn't
Right.
always that was also wasn't talking about it, and even was saying like, no, that is
Mm-hmm.
bad. It's you are dirty if you
Mm-hmm.
talk or think about this.
Or like it.
Right. Or have any sort of sexual desires. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, just from, and again, like there's no research, there's no
There's no
reference
references for where
to
this
where this
information is
inference
coming from or
coming
what
from. Yeah.
year this information is dated. Because I would
Um,
say a lot of this, like I said, oh, this sounds like the 80s because I was a teen into my adult years in the 80s, like 18, 19 adult years. I wasn't like in my 20s, but I was aware of that talk and
mhm.
those beliefs being shared. And so, yeah, I could place it. And not to say that that wouldn't have happened pre 80s. It probably wasn't as talked about, like maybe the 80s were revolutionary in talking about it. It just wasn't accurate information.
Right. Again, like the cultural differences. So, just based off of this was a very quick Google search of some
Uh-huh.
journal articles from the Journal of Adolescent Health. They did a study for 14 to 17-year-olds. 418 were male, 402 were female. 36.3% of 14-year-old males reported masturbation in the past month. 4% of 17-year-old males reported masturbation in the past month. 43.3% of 14-year-old females reported masturbation in the last month, and 58% of 17-year-old females reported masturbation in the last month. So, like,
Mm-hmm.
if anything, 14-year-old females are masturbating more than 13-year or 14-year-old males, according to
Mm-hmm.
this research study. And like, there's not a big difference between 64 and 58%.
Right, right.
It's not a huge discrepancy. And I think a lot of it is just the information. You're immersed in a culture where it's telling you you're a virgin and you need to stay a virgin
Mm-hmm.
because that is where your morality is placed, is in your virginity. Then of course you're going to be like, this is my pureness and I need to, I don't know, keep that or secure it or
Mm-hmm.
maintain it or whatever. And then the other part in all of this is men are just these sexual beings. That is their only
Mm-hmm.
need is sex. Uh, where is the, so this is a direct quote from Williard Hartley from his book. The typical wife doesn't understand her husband's deep need for sex any more than the typical husband understands his wife's deep need for affection.
So many problems with that. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I don't know if I've said this on the podcast before. I say it to a lot of my male clients. And I think the villain is patriarchy because
Hmm.
it's a villain that's pretty widespread. So to me, I'm like, yeah, patriarchy. We are a patriarchal culture. Most countries have patriarchy. Some of them have evolved away from that, but a lot of them are still either they came up through the patriarchal lens or are still there. And
Mm-hmm.
so I will say in patriarchy, men get two emotions.
Yeah.
They get anger and they get sexual desire. And women get the rest. They don't get those two. Women don't get sexual desire without being called names, and they don't
Mm-hmm.
get anger. Nobody likes an angry woman, right? So the two that men get are very gendered, and they are not ones women get. And it's not like we respect women for having emotions. We'll roll our eyes. We'll make fun of her. We'll be like, okay, now you're being hysterical. Or
Hysterical.
I was listening to an interview the other day. I'm wanting to say, who was it with? I've been listening to some of Jasmine Crockett's stuff.
Mm.
So it could be her, but I don't know that it was, but it was like one of our female representatives, congresswoman or senator, I'm not sure. And she was
Of the
like,
state of Utah.
no, 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 federally. And oh, it's on the tip of my brain who it was. Anyway, so she was just kind of pointing out a way that this person was wrong. And they were saying, okay, oh, I know, it was Stephen Miller. He
Mm.
is one of the most loathsome creatures. I did not know of him until he climbed out of his hiding spot in the first Trump administration. But he just is Yeah. And so it was him. And it was a interviewer on CNN who was asking him some questions about maybe their immigration policy or something. And she's just asking a question and he didn't answer it. And so she said, well, that's not my answer. And he was like, well, there's no need for you to get hysterical. Or no, he used the word histrionic. You don't need to get histrionic. And she's calm. She's not emotional. He is. And I think I don't know if it's a genuine emotion. He seems to end up yelling at most people who interview him unless they like him and they are flattering him. He seems to end up yelling at people, particularly women. So again, those emotional things, I will say to my male clients, this is going to handicap you. It has handicapped you.
Mm-hmm.
And you have got to claim your birthright to the whole spectrum of emotions, or this will continue to get in the way of you being a functional person who has a life of meaning. It will just get in the way if these are the only two you have. And often then we see those two start to fuse, anger and sex drive, right? So anyway, kind of off on that tangent, but
yeah,
I think it's very damaging. And we see the results of that in our office.
Right.
I think we also see it with women where we're saying, does this make you mad? And they'll just be like, I don't get mad. And I'm like, that's not, you need to have all of the emotions.
Right. Because there is such a thing as healthy anger and being angry, you know.
Right. And typically that informs your need for a boundary. It informs your expectations. It informs what you believe you deserve. Or does, like, in many ways, anger is a very functional emotion.
Yeah. This was one of the ones that I had crossed out and rewritten. So I put, the typical wife doesn't understand her husband's deep need for sex and affection any more than the typical husband understands his wife's deep need for affection and sex. There's probably a better way to rewrite that. But as I was sitting there, I was just like, we all need this. I don't know why we're like blanket statement of I need this and women need this and whatever.
Well, and he did say, from what you told us, that at one point he did say, or maybe it's in his material, that women are just as satisfied with sex without orgasm. What was that he was talking about?
Okay. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Okay. Some women find that they do not need to reach climax to be happy with the action of intercourse. It can be just as enjoyable without it as it is with it. And then a direct quote from Willard Harley is, a sensitive man will not put pressure on his wife to climax because he realizes that she may enjoy sex more without one.
Yeah. I will just state the women I worked with who had not had orgasm and did not understand how their body worked were not sexually satisfied.
No. Or emotionally satisfied.
No.
Or the satisfaction of their affectional needs, apparently.
Right. Will do more damage to the relationship because the man is being given this information that, like, I will say this before I continue that sentence. I've worked with men who get too caught up in their wife's climax and own it as part of their masculinity or their proudness. And I'm like, no, that's not yours. But it more often would reinforce that stereotype that the husband does not need to focus on his wife's pleasure.
Right. Or the whole through line of all this material is that men are just their just need for sex, their hunger for sex is just so all consuming.
Right.
And that's how they define their masculinity. And I think you're right. Like, I don't know, like some of this is like, because it even says men should listen to their partners once and never put pressure on her to do more than she wishes. Well, yeah.
Sure.
That's called consent. Like,
yes.
Thank you for that.
And sometimes with some of the female partners that I work with who grew up in very conservative religions and got some pretty messed up messages about sexuality, I'm having to help them explore the idea that they might not really know what they want or like. And that doesn't mean that he should be pushing her,
Right.
but you might need to open up and explore some things that, yeah, maybe you think are wrong or bad or feel uncomfortable initially. And that doesn't mean it's wrong. That's about your conditioning.
Yeah. And even just the, because this comes from a lot of Emily Nagoski's work of men don't have orgasms all the time. Sometimes they lose their erection.
Right.
So what does that mean? Does that mean you're less of a man? And what,
Right.
again, like, what does this term man even mean?
Right.
Yeah, just no one should be putting pressure on anyone to have an orgasm. I think it was Emily McGowan. Yeah, she said, like, what is it? Pleasure focused. We're focusing on pleasure versus outcome.
Right.
Yeah. And then when I read this statement or when I hear it, some women find that they do not need to reach climax to be happy with the action of intercourse. She may enjoy sex more without one. Okay. Also, if we're talking to women who have grown up in conservative religions, they might not know what an orgasm is, or they might be shameful of their bodies. They might know what an orgasm is and be shameful about it, whatever.
I mean, there was a time period that I was doing this, and I know Rachel was working with me, and we would talk about how often in sessions we were pulling out our whiteboard and drawing the female anatomy and
Right.
giving education on the different parts. I'm not I don't draw well. That's not one of my skills, but I'm giving them the idea. Right. I'm like, it's close enough that,
Sure.
I mean, it's not an illustration or something.
Yeah.
But it was just a lot of sessions that I was having to do that in. And same with Rachel at the time. She was like, yeah, there's a lot of like just education around female anatomy, how it works, what orgasm is. And I mean, okay, yeah, if you don't know that, then you do need to be aware of this.
Great. Yeah. And like how women have orgasms. I think there's a lot of myth around vaginal orgasms versus clitoral orgasms and all that stuff. Yeah, like another huge misconception that's in this material is men can experience arousal at any time, any place, no planning is necessary. It is difficult for women to understand this fact that a man getting aroused quickly is not being lustful. It is simply an automatic biological function that can often occur without intent.
Which again, I would say maybe that's more accurate in the like 16 to 20 age range or 22. I don't know. But I would hope that, I mean, actually, I know because there's been research on men, and that is proven to be a myth, that adult men older than the 20s would have sex anywhere, anytime with anyone. They're just ready to go. And that's largely proven to be a myth. There's a lot of myths around male sexuality that I still hear and that are still perpetuated, including in your class.
Right. And I think we can talk about the men experience, but then we're also like, this statement is excluding the women's experience. Like, I think women too can get aroused. Maybe not anytime, any place, no planning necessary, but like.
Well, but men can't do that either.
Right. Or
is what the research is showing is the majority of men do not work that way either. So then when we look at arousal, it's not like that. It's a little more nuanced. It's got to be more complex than what that represents.
Right. There's a thing called arousal non-concordance. You should look it up, or you should just read Emily Nagoski's book.
Right.
If you haven't read it. Yeah. And then like it says here, for women, arousal occurs through a matter of mindset. I don't know what that means. Like she just needs to be like her head in the game. I don't know. She chooses to experience.
Having come of age, right, in the 80s. Yeah. I can tell you that mindset or what they're thinking is that if a woman decides she wants to be sexual, than she can be, which I feel like if we really believed that, we would have a lot stricter laws around sexual assault and rape if that was the common understanding that women can only be aroused if they set their mind to it. But I think largely what it means is there's some complexity around female bodies and how they work sexually. And we don't know what it is, so we make it a mind matter. Which oftentimes I think when women are in their head, it actually gets in the way of their sexual desire more often than not.
Yeah, like I'm not, there's not a lot of arousal happening when I'm like going through my to-do list or whatever,
Right.
or my
Right.
brain is just racked, or even just thinking about, okay, am I aroused enough? Is this enough? Am I there yet?
Right.
Whatever.
Did that movement seem weird? What do they think? All of that's going to shut down the arousal and sexual like building for both genders. Getting in your head too much is going to take you out of the sexual experience.
That's called sexual breaks and sexual gas, or arousal breaks and gas, or breaks and gas. I can't remember the terms.
Accelerator.
Yeah, accelerator and breaks. Pretty much this whole podcast is just a go buy Emily's book.
Right. The book Come As You Are.
Yes. Well, Come Together is good too.
Yeah, it is for couples. Yeah.
But for the basic stuff, come as you are. Another major theme throughout all of this material is that there's an assumption that apparently men just don't need affection and attentiveness. Like men can experience arousal anytime, any place, no planning necessary. But for women, she has to experience arousal through affection, attentiveness, tenderness, warmth, kindness, and respect. So like you guys again need to be respected.
Right. That goes into though more of those myths around males.
Right.
That still get perpetuated, and why we see so many males in our office who are needless and wantless.
Well, besides sex, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But they don't know. And even if I say to them, like if they're dating and sex is on the table, and I'll say, under what conditions do you want to have sex? They're usually like, what? I don't know.
Right.
Or sometimes they went on a date, maybe a first date, and she kept pushing sex and they ended up not having sex. And then they come in and feel bad about that. And I'm like, well, it doesn't sound like you wanted to have sex. And they're like, I don't think I did. But they're just not connected to that knowing. And that's sexual needs and wants. But it goes beyond that too. Like just that means like that stereotype of men of like, well, I'm strong, I'm tough, I need nothing, I'm going to go conquer the world. No, it doesn't work for men.
Right. Or I had a thought, but like, yeah, your highest need. Oh, that was the other thing that the demise of many successful men in marriage and career is their uncontrollable sex drive. If not satisfied at home, they often turn elsewhere, which is like a weird kind of backhanded, because it says the demise of many successful men. So it's like trying to put the blame on the man, but then also, and if not satisfied at home, they often turn elsewhere. So then it like puts the blame back on the woman,
who may or may not have discovered her sexual desire.
Yeah, and she needs help
from
her male counterpart to figure that out. But like somehow we have told men, or for some reason, whatever, the patriarchy has told men, you can have sex and that's it. Like that is all you'll ever need and want. Apparently, you're not going to want affection. You have no other feelings.
Right.
And that's not makers of great, healthy sex.
No. And sometimes, like when I'm working with male sex addicts and they're reporting how often they have triggers to act out. And I'm always like, what's underneath that? What need is behind that? Let's say all of your emotions, all of your needs, all your wants only got channeled through sex.
Mm-hmm.
And we're trying to expand that. Like, what is behind that trigger to go sexually act out? What's actually, what motion is actually behind that? And that takes some time for them to start to make guesses. Sometimes it starts with me guessing, like, well, you said this. I would think it was a need to be seen or some sadness. Like, I'm initially the one guessing. And then
Right.
they start to make those guesses themselves and then start to actually have more informed guesses. And then eventually they know what's going on inside of them. And at the very, very top of that iceberg, all we were seeing were triggers to be sexual.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know if you know this, but like at what point, because I think the average age that we stop hugging our sons or boys is like 7 or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like at what age are we starting, like boys are starting to just conflate sexual needs and desires with actual emotional needs and desires of like, oh, I actually want a hug. That's really actually all I want, but I apparently can't have that. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to now I'm 15 and I'm just going to masturbate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, like,
I mean, I think it's gradual, but Pat Love, in one of her books, talks about how there is research done on infants and how long the person holding the baby gazes into the eyes of the infant. And let's say it's like 4 seconds longer for baby girls than it is for baby boys. And she says in her book, like, lest you think that's about the baby, they take the same baby that got less gaze and dress it up as a girl and it gets longer gaze. So what that says is the holder of the infant is projecting those stereotypes and what is needed on the baby. Like that's not coming from the infant, that is coming from the person doing the gazing. And that starts, like in the first 3 months of life. And so I think, and she goes through this timeline for boys and just how often they are given the message that they don't need relationship, they don't need soothing, they don't need comfort because they're tough. You got this, jump up, you're fine. And with little girls, we'll be like, oh, come here, let me give you a kiss, let me give you a hug. And that can happen at 1 year to 18 months.
right. Which again goes back to these like weird biological differences that we've
Mm-hmm.
like created out of there's no scientific back. I mean, maybe a little bit, right? Maybe there are some biological, but emotional needs are not biological. That's going to
No,
be for
yeah,
everybody.
right.
Like
And it's
boys are
certainly
not
not
just like,
there at 18 months.
right. Like all little kids are going to fall and cry
Mm-hmm.
and they want to be nurtured in that
Mm-hmm.
moment.
Well, and I know
Yeah.
there's research on classroom and that I think it's up until like third grade, boys and girls are called on equally to answer questions about all
Yeah.
subjects. And in fourth grade, boys tend to get called on more for science and math questions, and girls get called on for reading and writing questions. And there's nothing discernible about the children. They were equally called on up until fourth grade. And
Right.
then some of that switches and changes according to what we perceive as biological differences, which are not because we're literally making that environment.
Right. What is natural for
Mm-hmm.
boys and what is natural for girls.
Yeah.
I don't know. I have a fourth grade girl, and every time I pick her up from school, she is like, I ask her, how was your day? What did you guys do? And the first thing out of her mouth is science. Like that is literally her
Mm-hmm.
favorite time of day.
Yeah.
So yeah. And
Right.
then I have a second grade boy whose teacher thinks that boys tend to not like reading as much as girls. So
Mm-hmm.
like
Right. And I
there's
had
just a
four
lot of
girls
beliefs.
and they all had different interests and strengths.
Right.
They were not all the same in their needs and strengths in school. They all were different.
Right. So anytime we get material that is generalized between genders and
Mm-hmm.
sexes and it's blanket statements, that should be an indication to whoever's listening that that material is probably wrong.
Right. And especially if there's no resource or reference for that.
Right.
And if
Or
there is a
room for
reference,
new.
and if it
Yeah,
is a reference and it's I don't know, early 1990s, call it into question because I think so much has changed since then.
absolutely. When someone is giving you a piece of paper that says for women and there's
Right.
nothing on there about the affection for men on your For women, sex symbolizes protection, comfort, approval, and security.
Yeah. Well, and it says here, here's like early marriage scenarios that cause issues, it sounds like. And he says he is affectionate during courting, but after marriage, his emphasis is on sex, often with limited affection. Also assuming that they're not sexual before the marriage or during courting, to use his words.
Right. Which, feels very outdated and which, I don't know, I guess Patrick Carnes does use the word courting, but I think it's in a very different way of like we're breaking down how courting is versus, this patriarchal idea of courting.
Well, and the courtship dimensions don't end after marriage. If they get married, the courtship dimensions don't change.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's more. If we get away from physical intimacy, like women need to be respected. So does everybody. Right. Everybody needs to feel respected.
And it's assuming the women are not respected.
Right.
Which, in patriarchy, they are not.
Right. Well, and it's funny because in here it talks about how, men, you should just involve her in the decision making. And I'm like, where am I? What century am I in right now?
Right.
When have we stopped? I don't know. Anyways, you build her self-esteem and sense of security by asking for her input whenever possible.
What a novel idea.
But I don't know. And there's and it's actually interesting. So some of the material that this instructor pulls from is from some professors that my boyfriend took in college from a psychology course.
Okay.
So he did go to a Christian college. One of the quotes one of the things that they pull from these college professors is men say 3 times as many words in public as they do in private, while women say 3 times as many words in private as they do in public.
I'm aware of some research. Again, I don't know when I learned it or became aware of it, which could tell me if it was good research or bad research, but it was more about that women say more words in general than men do and are more expressive than men are, which again makes sense, not biologically.
Yeah.
But if women are allowed to be aware of their needs, not their sexual ones, but other needs, if they're given those relational skills from young ages, then it would make sense they're going to be more expressive and say more words than men are. But again, I don't know if it was valid research and if it took in the nuances. I don't remember where that came from. So I don't know how old I was when I became aware of it.
I thought that was interesting. And I also was like, I don't know why. Again, when we put it into black and white terms like that, my insides start to kind of resist and being like, I don't know.
So this is interesting too. This is, again, likely scenarios early in marriage.
Yeah.
And again, we're talking about sex, but it says the guy typically thinks the girl has experienced what he has and believes that she is as ready as he is. This is not always true. He does not understand that for most women, they need to learn how to enjoy the sexual experience. And then he says most men don't understand this and women don't know how to approach this issue with their partner. But I would say too, oftentimes men learn how the woman's body works from women.
Right.
It is not his job to teach her what feels good, what leads to climax, what doesn't. He can be taught as she's directing, but it's also not catch-all. Like all women like this. If you do these things, then every woman, that's going to be her preference.
Right. Like I think about this, that quote. I mean, in the 90s, there wasn't the internet and we weren't dealing with internet porn at that time. But like, if we were to now take that and insert it into 2025, I'm going to use the word people's sexual experience, like the way that they're learning about sex is through internet porn. Yeah, that's not realistic. That is not what healthy sex is or looks like. Women are not turned on just from penetration and they're not just instantly aroused. Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions about what it means to have healthy sex in this. And I think I was thinking about this after the class of like our ethics as therapists. Part of me feels like this material feels unethical to teach. Like it feels like it's doing
Absolutely.
more
Yes.
harm than
Yeah.
good.
Right.
Because I don't know, what if a young person, a young man is sitting in that class really just trying to figure out how do I be in a relationship and hears like, well, women don't develop sexually and might
Right.
never, and it is your job to teach them. That's not that's not healthy. And
Right.
that's not going to give this person what they need of how to build healthy
Hmm.
relationships and healthy sexual relationships.
Or like if they're not only heterosexual, does that teach them?
Right. Right. And that's the other problem with this class is this is not inclusive to everybody.
Hmm.
Um, this is very heteronormative information. And even for like,
Heteronormative, bad information, but still
right, right.
heteronormative.
And that's even for people who identify as heteronormative, it's bad information for you
Hmm.
too.
Right. Right.
This is not good for anybody.
Right.
Um, Yeah, and I remember in the class when we were talking about sexual drives and how women they don't have much of a sexual history and it's like it felt like what he was trying to say was it is a man's job, like you're saying, Jackie, it is a man's job for him to help the woman along to discover this thing.
Mm.
Like, I'm sorry, but how many men out there even know where the clitoris is?
Right.
Do they? Or even know that women have three holes.
Right.
Whatever.
Well,
Yeah,
and
there was a
if
lot.
women aren't learning that, again, there are some biological differences to the parts here. What type of stimulation and what
Mhm.
work for each, right? Again, you can't say there's these three things that work for women and these three things that work for men because
Right.
people are more nuanced than that. But a man knowing how what is arousing to him and what feels good to him does not necessarily transfer to what feels good and works for her. And if we're giving him the job of teaching her how this works, yeah, she might never find out how it works.
Right. Right. Are there any other points in here that we
I will say on one of the groups that Rachel and I were doing, this was a couple years ago, but we were talking about how we can meet our own needs and how we can
Mm.
have others meet needs for us. That idea that Pia Melody talks about as a functional trait of, or a trait of functional adulthood, that I'm able to take care of my own needs and I can also ask for help or accept help. And I think the conversation came up about touch and like, well, you can't really meet your own needs for touch. And I was like, yes, you can. And they're like, well, not just like masturbation. We're not talking about that. Like hugging or those comforting touches. Like you can't meet that need for that.
Yeah.
And I remember saying, if you're wanting a hug from another person, if that's the need or if the want, yeah, then you can't do that yourself. But if you need a soothing caress, I'm like, I touch myself non-sexually all the time.
Right.
And they're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, I might rub my arm. I put lotion on. I live in a dry state. I put lotion on every day,
Yeah.
multiple times a day on my hands. And usually, if I'm wearing short sleeves, I'll rub it on my hands and I might rub it up my arms. I'm like, sometimes when I'm talking, I'll just, like, or I might touch my face. I don't know. And they were just like, men don't do that. We don't do that. And I was like, okay, but you could. You could. Also, you need lotion too. I tell my husband this all the time. It's not just me that needs lotion in this state. You need lotion too. And I don't know why you'd rather let your skin get so dry that it
Dry.
cracks and
Yeah.
bleeds. Um, he's doing better now. But
Mm.
um, some of the men went out and found some nice oils that they use during the winter for their hands and have talked about that. Like, this is
Yeah.
what I've started using. As beards got more fashionable, they're doing more styling that way. But again, I think that goes back to childhood of if I don't get touched by a parent or a caregiver, then it doesn't happen. And that's sad. And
And just teaching.
the next time they have a chance at touch is sexual.
Right. Or even just teaching boys and men, y'all can hug each other.
Yeah. Yes.
Like it's okay for you to do that, you
Yeah.
know?
Which the group
Um,
that Rachel and I run, we talked, this was years ago, we were talking about an ending ritual. Like, how do we want
mm,
to end every group? And we had done different things. Every round of group, we'll talk about what's the ending ritual. And this one group, they were like, I think we need to do hugs. And
mm,
I was like a big group hug. And they were like, no, one-on-one hugs. We go around and we hug everybody before we leave. And so I was like, okay. And that has stayed their ending ritual. And sometimes when men have joined the group and they'll say, hey, this is how we end, we give a hug. And sometimes they're a little like, well, it's a lot to show up and talk to men about my feelings. And now you're going to hug
right,
me. And so sometimes
right.
they'll be like, okay, you get a pass today, but next week we're going to hug. This round that started in January, there were two new guys and they were telling them the ending ritual. And they were like deer in the headlights look. And one of the guys was like, well, do we give him a pass on week one? And two of the other guys were like, no, bring it in. We're going to hug you. And, and they hug. And now they hug
Yeah,
when they get there. They hug before they leave. They love
yeah,
it. They love it.
yeah. And it's, it's amazing to me. I'm raising a son and that starts early,
Yeah.
and I'm divorced and I cannot control what happens over at his dad's house. But like, there was a couple weeks ago, actually, may have been a couple months ago. My son was like doing sit ups in the living room. And I was like, buddy, what are you doing? And he's like, I want a six pack. And I'm like, you are 7. Like,
Right.
what? He's like, I want to be strong. I'm like, you're strong for a 7-year-old. Like, what are you planning on doing with this strength of yours? But yeah, like how early that starts is so
Mm-hmm.
concerning. The messages that he's already getting, the way that I look at him when I pick him up from school and see how my daughter's interacting versus how he's interacting, he's a lot more aggressive with the other
Mm-hmm.
kids. And like it's just amazing to me. And even sometimes with him, he's like do the side thing with me
Mm-hmm.
now where and I try to hug him and I'm like, no, you're gonna hug me. I
Yeah.
mean, within reason, right?
Right.
I
Right.
don't force it on him, but yeah, it's like it's scary. And so to hear stories about, I don't know the ages of these men. I'm going to assume between the ages of like late 20s to beyond, right?
In my group, you
Like,
mean?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I would say.
yeah. Like, Jackie, could you imagine being 50 years old and not knowing, not having physical affection outside of sex? That seems crazy to me. And yet,
Mm-hmm.
it happens all the time. And stuff like this, telling men your greatest need is
Mm-hmm.
always going to be sex to the point where you might ruin your career over it.
Right. Right. Yeah. Which again, even underneath that, like human beings have a need for touch.
Right.
Women do and men do. And so again, if
Non-sexual touch, like
yes,
healthy
yes.
non-sexual touch.
But
Yes.
if men can't do that, they're going to go for sex. And what's underneath
Right.
that deep need for sex that he talks about?
Right.
What's underneath that? Well, it's probably being allowed to be a fully feeling human being.
Right. That wants affection.
Yes, yes.
Like you too want affection and it's okay for
Right.
you to want affection. And here it talks about cuddling after sex, like the afterglow.
And that women
And
need.
yeah, like women want to cuddle for 20 minutes after 20 minutes to an
Oh,
hour following sexual fulfillment. And then it says men can lose their sex drive immediately after climax. And I had said in my note, I wrote on the side, I was like, why do we need a sex drive to cuddle? You don't need a sex drive to do this. Again, why are we conflating
yes.
sex with non sexual physical intimacy?
Right.
You
That
need sexual to do that.
cuddling is a form of intimacy. And men can still be intimate after they climax. And women can be too. It's understanding on a deeper level that the differences are much more, the differences that we see are a lot more socialized and then reinforced through the family they grow up in, the culture they grow up in, all of that, that it is biological. That's when you start to get this information and think, bullshit, that's not true. And I tell men, like, sometimes they will ask me, so that's not true about men and needs and stuff. And I'm like, no, it's not. And that's the good news. Because otherwise, you know where the end of the road is for this? High rates of depression, suicide, violence.
Right.
That's where this message gets you.
Right. And I can think of a lot of clients right now where that has gotten them, or even clients' family members, right? Like the client may want to come in and get help, and then they talk about family members, and they're just like, my dad's an alcoholic and a porn addict. And I haven't, like, I can't remember the last time we've hugged each other. And it's like, that's why you're in my chair right now.
Right.
Yeah. And from a like addiction perspective, you know, this doesn't help. This information is not.
I mean, this information is part of how they got into addiction.
Right. Exactly.
For male addicts.
Right. And you are more than a sexual being. You're like a full, complex human.
Yeah. And you can bring that complex human to sex.
Yeah.
They're not these disconnected things.
Right. Right. And I just finished Erotic Intelligence by Alex Katahakis. And we were talking about that book a little bit, and about like male and female energies and how we all have them. And all of us are bringing that into sexual desire. So for men, they're not just these, like, sex is their highest need, because it's not.
Right.
Affection is too. And for women, affection is not your highest need. Desire is too. And that's okay.
Right.
And like both parties, we've been talking a lot about men and women. And again, I think it's because the context of this material is the hetero, cisgender, heterosexual relationship. But for anybody on any spectrum, there is both sort of, you can use whatever words you want, masculine, feminine energies. Like we all have that, and we're all bringing that into our relationships and sexual relationships. Because I'm thinking about, like, how sad would it be to have a sex life or a sexual relationship with someone without any affection? That doesn't sound pleasurable.
Connecting.
Yeah. Like that is not a good foundation for if your desire is to have a long lasting, in the context of this class, another marriage after a divorce or just a first marriage.
Yeah.
To just have sex be the basis of affection and intimacy, that's gonna crumble. That's not long lasting.
Right.
Yeah. So,
and should evolve. Sexuality should evolve with the person. And the way this is taught, it acts like sex is this one way, one thing, and it's not evolving with the person, because the person doesn't, I guess, have needs, or wants.
Well, the man does. The man need is sex.
Right. So their
affection.
sexuality wouldn't really evolve, because women don't need sex. So it's not like their sexuality would evolve.
Right. Which actually, when I was researching for some of this, you know, one of the things, I mean, I was researching more for adolescents, but one of the things that came up was like women's, and I just glanced at it, Jackie. So I'll have to go back through and see. I mean, it was from, I believe, Harvard. Okay. It was from one of the National Institute of Medicine or mental health, but it was like the peak of women's sexual drive is in their 40s.
Yeah. Yes, I did know that.
Yeah, like their mid to late 40s. So that's going to change for them. And that makes sense. Or even, I think the range was like 45 to 65 or something like that. Yeah. And then what happens if you're like, oh, sorry, my foot's stuck.
Also, you hear a lot of women talk. I don't know if there's research on this, but I've heard women talk about how in their 40s, they started coming more into who they were and not listening to all of the societal messages about women and all of the messages coming from the beauty industrial complex. And then I remember when Oprah turned 50, she had some women who were older than her. I think And then she had some women who were in their 50s, right? And all of them just talked about like, maybe it takes 50 years for us to get to this place of just like, I know who I am, I'm enough, I'm determining how I feel about myself, and I'm so confident in that. So that could coincide with when women's sex drive really hits its peak, is at a time when women are really coming into themselves and their own power and defining themselves instead of being defined by males or society or whatever.
The billboards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Utah is really interesting with their billboards. Like, I don't know, there's one right now that's like, it's from a plastic surgeon. It's about bikini season and breast augmentation. Anyways, maybe you've seen it. It's just a really interesting billboard. It's like, it's that time of year. What? Anyways, I mean, that makes sense. And I feel like that may be changing a little bit. I don't know. I'm like 33, so I sometimes I'm like, I cannot wait to be 40 because I feel like then I will have some shit figured out. But I think with kind of like, I don't know, the only way that I can phrase it is like the Victoria's Secret, Amber and Fitch era, like the downfall of that has changed. And with that change in the early 2000s has also changed some of the messaging to women sometimes, right? I think it depends on where you're at, and the culture from where you're at.
I mean, I think there's a pushback currently to that. And I love that the childless cat ladies started to push back when they started getting stigmatized and talked about like they weren't humans or they had less value somehow because they were childless.
And not married.
Right. And there is certainly that push right now. Like I have like respected, and I think Gavin Newsom is a fairly intelligent political leader. I don't live in California, so I don't know how Californians feel about him. But he started this new podcast, and his first guest on it was Charlie Kirk, which I was like, what? No, sorry, I'm not gonna do that. I think I'm gonna write a comment. I saw a clip on it of that podcast on something else, and I'm just like, what are you doing? If you think you might run for president in 28, that just sealed the deal for no. Just the way Charlie Kirk talks about women. And one of our problems as a society is women are not marrying at younger ages. And they're waiting until their 30s when they are less likely to get married. Their chances of getting married go down. All of these problems with women in their 30s. And I'm like, I don't know that that's true. I think women in their 30s can still be very attractive to men. But it is that stereotype of women's role is to get married. And he says, Charlie Kirk says this, like something about achieving partner at your law firm will never bring you the satisfaction of getting married and having kids. And I'm like, well, she could do both.
Right.
And yeah, they're not equatable. They're different kinds of satisfaction. And they both come with their own headache, right? But it's just that pushback to women starting to define for themselves what makes them enough, who they are, what a good woman is.
Right. Yeah, we're in a very interesting political time. It'll be, I mean, I think there is a lot of fear around the demise of the conservative family.
Yeah.
And what that means for our system as a whole.
Which there has been since the 80s when divorce started being more
when this book came
of an
out.
option. Yeah. when divorce started being more of an option and not fault divorce was an option.
Right. Women can have their own credit card.
Yes.
And open all up a business loan.
All of these. No, that wasn't until 88. Get a business loan was 88.
Okay. So late. I mean, this book
because
came out in
that was
1986.
that was
so
the
late
year I
80s.
graduated from high school. The pushback began because all of these marriages that we held up in Christianity saying, this is what a marriage looks like, got divorced, right? I remember being a teenager and knowing my parents did not have a good marriage and looking at different couples at church and thinking, well, they have a good marriage and then they get divorced. Well, they have a good marriage and then they get divorced. And oh, they have a good marriage. And then I'm working in their home office for the husband and I'm hearing the fights and I'm like, nope, never mind, not a good marriage. So I was seeing that these are not good marriages, but I think they were being held up until women started being able to divorce. And I think they have felt like that was the downfall of society and have tried to push back since the 80s.
Right. Because God forbid we just say, hey guys, maybe we just have fully functioning feelings and admit to ourselves that we like to cuddle after sex.
Yes.
And we actually don't want to play this role anymore of having to make all the decisions and having to go to work. Maybe we want to be stay-at-home dads, like to do that is, a ridiculous thought. Why should we do that? Why don't we just continue to push this narrative that the conservative family is the ultimate family and we need to do anything to preserve that narrative or whatever. The first thought that came into my head was like, yeah, I wonder how many of those women were just like not having orgasms. They were just like, I'm done. I don't want to be married to this person anymore.
I remember because when my parents divorced, it was me, my older sister lived out of state. So she was supportive of what we were doing, but wasn't really on the ground with us. So me and my brother, 4 years younger than me, and my brother, 6 years younger than me, but he was still a minor. My brother, 4 years younger than me, would have been 18, so barely an adult. And we went to mom and said, you need to get a divorce. And she was kind of like, well, I mean, I want to wait until the youngest two are adults. And we were like, you're not doing them any favors. And I remember saying to my mom, there's a lot of things that are worse than getting a divorce, Mom, like staying in this marriage. And I remember her saying to me, well, Jackie, we've been married 28 years. And I said, and this was a little harsh, I get as my 20-something-year-old self, 22, 23. And I said to her, and wouldn't it be tragic if it was 29? Which technically they did have a 29th anniversary, but they were separated and then got divorced that next year. So to me, there's worse things than divorce, people.
Yeah, there are.
And staying in an unhappy marriage is one of them. That's not good for the kids. That's not good for anybody.
Right. Yeah. And when we talk about our remarriage success class inclusivity clause that was on the whatever, that's what I think of is like, we are inclusive, meaning we love divorced people.
Right. Well, and can you imagine if you're single, if you're divorced, and part of the marriage problems were sex, but part of the problems were sex. Right. And your husband has said this to you, I just have this need for sex, and you didn't believe him, or vice versa. You wanted your wife to have a need for sex and she just wouldn't. And then you go to this class and you're like, well, shit, they were right. They weren't right.
Right. There's no challenging of the beliefs or getting factual information of like, I don't know, especially as a woman to just be like, because it feels a little gaslighty, honestly, of that same scenario being like, oh, maybe it is okay that I'm not, that I, that his uncontrollable need for sex, like that's just normal. And so maybe there's something wrong with me. And that's that trauma piece that I was referring to earlier. Maybe there's some relationship trauma there of just like, or even again, like the religious piece, like my bishop hasn't actually happened, but like I'm sure it has somewhere. Like my bishop told me these things. And
we have had those partners who, when they go to their ecclesiastical leader, are told like, maybe you should be having more sex. And what isn't said is whether you want to or not, But
Right.
yeah, that's what they're told. When they're suspecting addiction, they're told, well, maybe you should have more sex, which lines up with men will ruin their careers
Right.
if they're not getting enough sex at home. Or if they
Right.
go outside the marriage, it's because they're not getting enough sex at home. And none of the messaging for males or females leads to good sex. Nobody's having good
Right.
sex with this
No.
paradigm, right? Or even for men. I've had men tell me how great the sex is in their marriage. And I know there's some domestic violence from her to him. And I'm like, that makes me question how good the sex is if this person can also break your nose or break your fingers.
Right.
Or I think I eventually said to him, like, it doesn't seem like it would be good sex because when there's violence happening, I just don't think that's a relationship that has good sex. So we might be using two different definitions of good sex, but I don't think this is what encapsulates good sex. Get some more updated people in the field who are talking about sex.
Yeah.
Well, I will say, Bridget, thank you so much for enduring this class so that we could be entertained as a staff and also have this great podcast episode talking about the do's and the do nots of talking about relationships and sex. Yes. Okay, see ya. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.